Uh, Thanks. I'm Michael Bennett, and I'm very grateful that Governor Polis is here today, Secretary Griswold, Attorney General Weiser, uh, uh, Clerk Paul Lopez. Thank you so much for having us here today and for your service to the city and county of Denver. We wanted to join together today because the most important election of our lives is in 78 days, and it's going to take place under conditions none of us ever would have anticipated or expected. A major economic crisis, a major public health crisis, and on top of that, daily attacks and disinformation on our election from the President of the United States. This is not something that he's just started in recent days. Since coming to office, he and Senator Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, have blocked every effort to make it easier for people to register, to make it easier for Americans to vote, to get the money out of our elections, and to defend our democracy against hostile actors that are trying to turn us against each other. And now we're in the middle of a major public health crisis, and the president is using it not as an opportunity to unite the country, but as an opportunity to keep attacking our democracy. For months, central to that attack have been false claims about mail-in voting, something we've had in Colorado for years. He said mail-in voting increases fraud, and America is and that's simply not true. As we know, in Colorado, an American is more likely to be struck by lightning than they are to commit fraud. An American is more likely to win the lottery than they are to commit fraud with a mail ballot. The Heritage Foundation, a very conservative think tank in Washington, found that out of 250 million absentee votes cast over a 20-year period, the rate of fraud was 0.00006% of all votes cast. That is virtually zero. President Trump has said it encourages foreign interference, the same foreign interference he denies is even happening. But his former Secretary of Homeland Security said Colorado was a national leader, a national model in safeguarding elections, saying, "We'd love to continue to use you as an example of what other states can adopt." That's what we believe as well. President Trump said Democrats are trying to use mail-in ballots to steal the election. Let's set the record straight on that. Someone should remind him that the year we adopted vote by mail, we elected my colleague, Senator Gardner, a Republican. In fact, in 2 of the last 3 elections in Colorado, more registered Republicans voted by mail than Democrats. For us, this is not about Republicans and Democrats. Republicans and Democrats in Colorado both have advocated for mail-in ballots. And I guarantee you this, if there were an effort to get rid of the mail-in ballots in Colorado, county commissioners all over our state, Republicans and Democrats, would join together to make sure that didn't happen, because Coloradans believe it's an essential part of our democracy. And it's an essential reason why, out of all 50 states, we are the second in terms of voter turnout. The discussion around mail-in ballots should have nothing to do with politics. And these are the facts, and we need to repeat them today and every day until the election, because the president knows exactly what he's doing by making these false claims. This is not my speculation. This is not my overstating the case. The president admitted it. Last week, he went on national television and said he was blocking funding for the Postal Service to keep states from expanding vote by mail. In other words, he's put his political future above our democracy and above the safety of the American people. So let me just end with this, and I'll turn it over to the governor. For a variety of reasons, our democracy is at risk. Democracy is fragile. It's not guaranteed that it's going to be here forever, that we're going to be able to pass it off to our kids and our grandkids. All of us have an important job to do. In Colorado, we have to hold up our example as a model to the country for how to vote safely in a pandemic. I can't tell you the number of times senators have come over to me on the floor, Republicans and Democrats, said, "Tell us how you do it in Colorado." In Washington, we have to make sure Our election officials have everything they need, and that the Postal Service has everything it needs for the elections in November. All of us should be getting, well, not all of us, but those that are unfortunate enough to serve in Washington, not here, should be getting on a plane today to pass that funding. Overriding the president is necessary. And all of us, no matter where we are or whom we support, have to push back against the disinformation and make sure our friends and neighbors have the facts about where to register and vote. This is a difficult time, but we've had difficult times in the past. Let's remember, Americans have voted during a civil war, a Spanish flu, the Great Depression, and 2 world wars. And no matter what the president says, we're going to vote in November, here in Colorado and all across the country. Let me end there and turn it over to our great governor, Governor Polis.
Thank you, Senator Bennett. You know, we are here today, members of Colorado's elected leadership, to demonstrate to the people of Colorado that our democracy will not become another casualty of this pandemic. Our democratic republic is simply too important for that. As Senator Bennett said, we've withstood challenges in the past and we will withstand this one. Free and fair elections are the bedrock of our constitutional republic. Every American should be able to exercise their right to vote without risking their health. Here in Colorado, we do that with the convenience of mail-in ballots. This year, of course, the COVID health crisis creates a challenge, like it does in many other parts of society. But we are proud in Colorado that we've led the way by demonstrating how safe and secure and reliable vote by mail can be. In fact, in 2013, voting by mail became the default way that people vote. Even before that, a majority of Coloradans voted that way. I certainly did. But since it's become the default, we've been able to make sure that we've been able to increase participation, reduce fraud, and make sure that we've been able to administer fair elections in our state. And we offer several ways of voting. If you don't want to vote by mail, you certainly don't have to. You can go to a polling location for early voting or even on election day. If you haven't registered to vote, you can still register to vote on election day for same-day registration. We now have pre-registration for 17-year-olds that will be 18 by election day, can register ahead of time. You know, our state, Colorado, and we can really be proud of this, has really set the gold standard. We are second in the nation for voter turnout, and we have a fully engaged participating citizenry. And that's something that both Democratic and Republican elected officials are grateful for. And, you know, in Colorado, we have strong safeguards to prevent fraud. Every ballot contains a signature box, and every voter's signature is verified by a bipartisan team of election judges. And if the signature doesn't match, the ballot is set aside. The person has an opportunity to show that it's theirs. And just so you know, in 2018, only 0.0027% of the 2.5 million ballots cast were suspicious enough to warrant investigative action, and then many of those were able to be cured. You know, because somebody's signature might change if they have a stroke or they have paralysis or some other condition, and those can all be validated and fixed. But generally, the signature verification works very well. It elevates some for investigation, and then those are done correctly. And of course, voting by mail is not a partisan issue. In fact, in our recent state primary administered by the Secretary of State and the county clerks, Republican voters used mail ballots at a higher rate than Democrats. So, you know, we here in Colorado can't figure out why this has been made a partisan issue nationally. This is about our core right as Americans to vote. People have fought and died for that right to vote and to expand that right to vote to women and people of color. And it's our right as Americans. And anybody who stands in the way is un-American and acting in a way that's contrary to our constitutional principles. This is a time to assure Americans across the ideological spectrum, the geographic spectrum, that elections are safe and secure and that the results are legitimate. Look no further than Colorado, where we've shown that voting by mail is safe, reliable, nonpartisan, and extremely popular. Over 99% of our voters vote with drop boxes and mail-in ballots. President Ronald Reagan said, "The right to vote is the crown jewel of American liberties, and we will not see its luster diminished." And I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. We will simply not allow our democracy to become a casualty of this pandemic. And now I'd like to introduce our terrific Secretary of State, who's been doing tremendous work preparing for this year's, to have a successful election here in Colorado this year, Jenna Griswold.
Thank you, Governor. Thanks for the applause. Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to see folks, especially during the times we're in. Thanks for coming out so early. I also just wanted to thank Senator Bennett, Governor Polis, Attorney General Weiser, and Clerk Lopez for being here today on this very important topic. Now, one of the things that all Coloradans share is the belief in accessible and secure elections. And there's so much that we have to be proud of right now. Before the pandemic, Colorado was considered the national gold standard in elections. And now during the pandemic, we have proven how resilient our elections and democracy truly are. We should be proud that in our statewide primary on June 30th, we set a record turnout in the midst of a pandemic. Coloradans overwhelmingly used mail ballots. In fact, in that election, 99.3% of all ballots cast were done so at a drop box or through the mail. And that includes with all of our early voting sites and same-day voting sites open. Vote by mail for all is the responsible way to run an election during a pandemic. This fight to expand vote by mail across the nation to ensure that all Americans have the same voting access as Coloradans is really personal to me. I want to share with you that my mom is a nurse and she worked to save lives on a COVID unit. I want to do the same thing in following in her footsteps and ensure that as Secretary of State, I'm focused on saving lives and also safeguarding our democracy. It's 2020, and no American should be forced to risk their life to cast a vote. Voting by mail is like wearing a mask. It can save lives and help stop the spread of COVID-19, which ultimately saves people like my mom who are frontline workers. Now, it seems that President Trump has been more concerned about suppressing the vote than suppressing the virus. With more than 170 Americans who have died from COVID-19, it's thousands of times more likely, very unfortunately, for an American to pass away from the virus than any type of voter fraud in any type of election. The president should focus on the pandemic instead of trying to undermine our elections in November. There is a coordinated effort to suppress the vote nationwide in November. Whether it's lying about vote by mail, inviting foreign interference into our elections, filing suit in states that are trying to use drop boxes, or the president last week saying that he is trying to attack the Postal Service to stop mail ballots. We can't allow the president, or anybody for that matter, to make it more difficult for Americans to vote, especially during a pandemic. You know, I was a voter protection attorney in 2012 and 2016. And in 2017, when President Trump tried to disenfranchise millions of Americans, including thousands of Coloradans, I ran for Secretary of State. That's why I will fight any attempt by the president to suppress American voters. We cannot allow him to tilt this election in his favor. And I will do everything in my power to stop him, and we're considering all options. But I will go back to what I started to say. Colorado should be so proud because regardless of the barriers that are thrown at us to try to make it more difficult to vote during a pandemic, we will have a great election in November. We should be proud that we are expanding vote by mail for all across this nation so that more Americans have the same type of access that Coloradans do. We should be proud that with the adoption of vote by mail, we increased participation rates by 9%, including 13% among Black voters, 10% among Latino voters, and 16% among young voters. And as a Secretary of State who's responsible for making sure all communities have their voice heard, I think it's important to say that too often voter suppression is systemic racism. And a tool that we have in this nation to battle that is vote by mail for all. Here in Colorado, we're proud to respect all eligible people's right to vote. The Colorado election model is so straightforward and it works. We know what works, we know what doesn't, and the Colorado election model should be spread to every state in the nation so that all Americans are afforded the same type of access and rights that we have. So thank you so much. And with that, I'd like to introduce our fantastic Attorney General, Phil Weiser.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Senator Bennett, for putting together. Thank you, Governor Polis and Secretary of State Griswold for leadership, and thank you, Clerk Lopez, for hosting us. This subject is the core of our constitutional democracy. When our founders created a framework for our system of government, the idea, as Lincoln put it, was a government of the people, by the people, for the people. A central premise and foundation is that the people's voices need to be heard. That's why we have a constitutional right for people's votes to be counted. And in a very wise move, our framers set up a system of checks and balances. One of the critical checks is that states have independent authority from the federal government, including to conduct elections. If you look at Article 1, Section 4, it makes plain that it is up to the states to set the time, place, and manner of how elections are conducted. We here in Colorado have set such a manner, a vote by home system that is indeed the envy of our nation, a system that's reliable. It's safe, it's secure, it's easy to use. That indeed is what our whole nation should work towards. And one of the upsides of this pandemic, as our Secretary of State noted, is to make plain how valuable it is in Colorado to have a safe system, and other states are now looking at it. In Article 2, the selection of presidential electors is governed by the states. In fact, I litigated that issue up to the U.S. Supreme Court, won unanimously the principle that states can oversee and manage presidential elections as they see fit, with a core commitment to vindicating our democracy. When our democracy is at stake, I will fight for it as Colorado's Attorney General. And that includes protecting a fair and constitutional census, another principle that we vindicated at the U.S. Supreme Court. We're living at a challenging time. It's a time when all of us have reason to be concerned about whether our federal government is indeed following the rule of law, is acting in service of our constitutional values, and honoring the premises of our democracy. We here in Colorado are committed to our democracy. We are going to fight for it using every tool we have. Let me turn over to one of the stalwarts for democracy, Denver's County Clerk, Paul Lopez.
Thank you, AG. Thank you all for being here. And thank you for being here as well. This is where the magic happens. This is where democracy happens. And I want to thank our staff and recognize our staff for continuing to be stalwarts. They are the true defenders of democracy. And in here, on any given election day, as a matter of fact, beforehand, you have bipartisan teams of election judges, of folks who are dedicated to ensuring that every single vote will count, and it'll be done so in a manner that is secure, and that is fair, and that is absolutely transparent. I want to just talk a little bit about the process. Our voter rolls are updated nightly, monthly, from the DMV, from the Department of Corrections, from the Department of Vital Statistics, to make sure that those lists are accurate. We work with USPS to make sure that our mail lists are accurate, so we're not sending ballots to addresses where nobody lives. We are bipartisan. We work in bipartisan teams. From when the ballots are received and weighed on these scales to when they come through the process and receiving and sorting and counting and signature verification, you have bipartisan teams. This is not about party. This is about our country. And one of those pillars of our country is democracy. I think of my grandfather. Yesterday was the 10th year anniversary since his passing. He played the role of my father. I think of how he came back. Here's a young man from a farmhand working in the fields of Alt, Colorado. Comes back after fighting in World War II, after being hurt. He had a limp, a very distinct limp because of his knee. And I just remember him since I was a kid, limping up that hill to go cast his ballot. I think of the sacrifice that our men and women have made for this very freedom to be able to elect and choose our leadership. And that's what separates us from so many, is that we are able to do that peacefully, and we are able to do that in a democratic way. I also want to send a message out there to folks whose intent is to try to interfere with our elections, whether you be foreign or domestic. You're going to find nothing but a brick wall of ballot security and people who are election judges, who are working every single day to make sure that our votes count and to make sure that our democracy stands in this country. And to make sure that no matter if you're Republican or if you're Democrat, if you're an independent, if you're a Green Party member, or if you're unaffiliated, you have the right to vote, and we will make sure that you have that right to vote. And right here in these rooms, we will make sure that that vote is counted. We are going to have an election, and we ask people to participate. And no, you don't have to come into person. You don't have to come in person to vote. We will mail you the ballot, and you will have 3 weeks to be able to look over every single subject on that ballot so you can make a sound decision, so you can vote. And we have 38 drop boxes around the city and county of Denver that you can put that in safely without ever having to come into contact with anybody else. I like to say we've been social distancing before it was cool. If you are one of those folks that wants to come and vote, feel free to, but please wear a mask. If you are one of those folks that wants to put 2 stamps on your ballot and send it in, know that you can still do it. Know that it will still be safe. And we work very hard to make sure that you can track that ballot through ballottrace.org so you can track that ballot. We track that ballot just to make sure that your ballot gets counted, it gets received and gets counted. So, having said that, this is not our first election, and this is not the first time we've ever stood up to a bully. We will make sure that your ballot counts. Thank you. And with that, we'll take any questions.
Mr. Weiser, I know that several attorney generals across the country are starting to have conversations about potential litigation for the Trump administration to protect the Postal Service. I'm curious if you're part of those negotiations and also what legal grounds there might be for a lawsuit.
We are indeed working with colleagues in different states evaluating the best legal options. I want to underscore a couple points I said today, which is it is indeed the constitutional obligation of the states to manage elections. And efforts by the federal government to undermine our constitutional duty and the individual rights of people to vote is something we take very seriously. So we're going to explore all avenues to protect our Constitution, to protect the right to vote, and to assert the rights of our states. And that's what we do as attorneys general. I'd very much like to be in a world where I could take for granted that the federal government was committed to following the rule of law to the best of their ability. Unfortunately, we are not in that world right now. In fact, this fall, we're going to be litigating about the Affordable Care Act, a law passed by Congress, upheld by the Supreme Court, which now is being undermined by the Justice Department. And so any threats to the rule of law, to our democracy, we will take very seriously.
And specifically, the litigation would be towards preserving the Postal Service's ability to handle elections, correct?
If there's a Postal Service undermining of state authority to manage elections, individuals' rights to votes, in ways that violate law, that absolutely is going to be of the gravest concern for us, and we are going to be looking at how we protect our states and our voters.
Yes, ma'am.
What are the chances that we'll know who the next president of the United States? I would call her a politician. I'm sure I'm mistaken.
Yes.
What are the chances we'll know who the next president of the United States is on November 4th?
Well, I could tell you what. We usually, I wouldn't get your expectations up to know exactly on election at 7 p.m. that we know who the president of the United States is. We here in this division, in Denver Elections Division, we value accuracy over speed. And we want to make sure that every single ballot is counted and it's done thoroughly. I would ask you guys to all help us spread the word, to be patient with us as those results come in. You know, it may take a little while. I'm going to put it out there, be forewarned that it may take a little while. But that's not because we're up to anything devious over here. You could always come in and peer in the windows. We have a lot of nosy neighbors that do that. We invite you to be a nosy neighbor in our window. That's because we're making sure that the processes that are designed from receiving all the way through sorting, through signature verification, to it being counted, are being accounted for. We're doing it thoroughly. So, I don't know if that answers your question.
Governor Polis, could you answer that question as well? Do you think that we'll know who the next president is on November 4th? Or is there a chance we'll be into mid-November?
Well, your question is related to how close the presidential race is, so it's anybody's guess at this point. If there's a decisive victory by one candidate or the other, we'll likely know on election night. If it's within a point or two in the states that matter for the Electoral College, then all of those votes will need to be counted. So, it's like any election. I think I had one election, my very first, where I ran for State Board of Education. In the year 2000, I won it by 92 votes, and I didn't know for a month and a half because there was a mandatory recount. In my election this time around, I knew by 9 p.m. So, just depends on how close it is.
You know what, if I may add something. The advantage that we have with mail-in ballots and mail ballots is you have 3 weeks to be able to vote. So I encourage folks to be able to vote and vote early. We are one of those states that are able to start tabulating and to start the process, so that we at least will have some amount of results for you. Now, mind you that our process is secure and it is what it is. We are the best in the business because of the process. We want to make sure that our election is certified. It goes through during the process within a week, it goes through an audit, and then it goes through a canvass of the election, and then the parties sign off, and then we certify the election, and that could take almost up to 2 weeks. So, and that's with any election. That's just what we do. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know who I should direct this to, but I'm wondering if any of you have heard reports of the Postal Service here in Colorado taking any steps that might impact the ability for us to have mail in, like whether it's removing mailboxes or removing mail sorting. We've heard some reports in other states. Are you aware of anything happening here in our state that could impact the election?
No takers.
I'll take it. I have not heard that in Colorado yet, and we need to be vigilant here just as we do need to be across the country.
One more thing. Close to 3/4 of our voters used very convenient drop boxes. About a quarter used the mail. I expect even more voters will use more convenient drop boxes. This year, Jenna Griswold, Secretary of State, has a program to help supply additional drop boxes to the counties. They're convenient. It saves people the cost of postage. So it could very well be, 80 to 90% use Dropbox. I use a Dropbox. They're usually right next to the mailbox. So if you Dropbox, you don't have to put a stamp on it. You have to put a stamp on it in the mailbox. So obviously, some people who live in remote areas or don't live near a Dropbox are going to use the mail. But they're both great ways to return your ballot.
Sasha? Hi, Sasha from the Denver Post. One of my reports that people were struggling to get appointments to get Colorado driver's licenses so that they are able to register to vote in time for the election. Is there some sort of process going on?
So yeah, you don't need a driver's license to vote in Colorado. You can have several different ways that you can identify yourself, a state ID, a passport, but also simply bills that arrive at your house that you can bring. So we have numerous ways that somebody can identify themselves, and we are not a state that requires that you drive just to be able to vote.
Senator Bennett, I was curious if you could provide an update on the coronavirus relief discussions and where things stand. I asked Senator Gardner whose fault it is.
Yeah.
He declined to say, but I'm curious if you point fingers to anybody, and I also wonder what the deal breaker might be.
Yeah, I mean, I hope very much that we're going to pass another coronavirus package. We desperately need it. You asked who the fault is. I would say Mitch McConnell, who's the majority leader. Months ago, this bill, the HEROES Act, passed out of the House of Representatives, doing really fundamental things that Colorado and other states need. For whatever reason, Mitch McConnell did nothing for several months to respond to that. Then we found ourselves on the floor, and he found himself incapable of delivering the votes for a package. But we have to do the work anyway. We can't have that be an excuse. You know, if we're going to pass a package that made sense, I think it would include 4 elements. One would be to make sure that unemployment insurance continued in some expanded form. That's made a huge difference. It's lifted 12 million people in the country out of poverty. It's been $2.5 billion to Colorado's economy, and you can't just turn it off the way it's been turned off without an incredibly cruel effect on families all across our country. So that's number one. Number two, I've got a bill with Todd Young from Indiana called the Restart Act that would provide much needed relief for small businesses all across this country. We now have 50 co-sponsors, equally divided between Republicans and Democrats. No other piece of legislation in the current discussion has that kind of bipartisan support. We provide working capital to small businesses for the rest of this year and then allow them 7 years to pay it back. Passing that bill is going to be the difference between hundreds of thousands of small businesses closing their doors forever and hundreds of thousands of small businesses surviving into the next year. I think the governor would join me in saying that state and local governments desperately need us to pass this bill. In Colorado, our state revenue is down 25%. Our county revenue is down anywhere between 30 and 70%. We've passed $3 trillion of stimulus, yet only $150 billion of that has been for state and local governments. You know, if we don't want to see a situation where we're laying off teachers, where we're laying off firefighters, where we're laying off police officers, compounding the severe economic situation that we're in, we need a bill that does its work with respect to state and local governments. And then the final point is we've got to do so much more to support the public health infrastructure in this country. We need the capacity to do contact tracing, to do testing, ultimately to provide the vaccines that hopefully are going to become available early in the next year. That infrastructure is threadbare across our country, and that's why I wrote something called the Health Force Act with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York to train literally 1 million people in this country to do that work, to support the public health professionals that are working so hard all over Colorado and all over the country. With just 90 or 100 hours of training, we could take people who today are unemployed, many of them living in the hardest hit communities by COVID, and put them to work in high-paying jobs. So we have got to pass another bill, and my view is we should all be back there today negotiating that bill, and I'm sorry that we're not.
Last question. With Colorado News Line for Attorney General, would you be able to share any more about the timeline for evaluating legal action to anticipating any announcements before Congress meets, hopefully later in the week? And if you could also share what states you are in conversations with.
So first, I do want to pick up something Michael Bennett just said, which is what needs to be in this package. I've worked with both Senator Bennett and Governor Polis on broadband, including 39 state AGs making the case. During this time, if you don't have access to broadband, you are disabled from online learning, telemedicine, commerce, entertainment, and more. It is critical that we address the digital divide. That's got to be part of what Congress puts on its agenda and what we in Colorado need to be doing. With respect to discussions, I'm not going to disclose who we're talking with. I will say I will talk with anyone who's concerned and interested. This is an American issue. It's not a partisan issue. I also will say we'll make sure that what we do is buttoned up. I don't relish the opportunity to sue the federal government. I look forward to not having to sue the federal government. I will make every effort to tell the federal government to follow the law, but when we conclude they don't and we've got a viable cause of action and an obligation to defend Colorado, I will do that. And so that's the analysis we're in. Before we would take any action, we need to make sure that we're confident, we've got the right theories, we've got the facts behind it, and we're doing what's in Colorado's best interest.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for hosting us, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah. Thank you.